Hi, everybody. I'm HF Day. I am a dark fantasy writer, and I am here with Astra Crompton today. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your book?
Hi, I'm Astra. I write fantasy of all flavors, and this series specifically is an epic second world fantasy. The first book that came out in this world was Firstborn. That was almost 10 years ago now, and I'm currently working on the Prophet's Tale trilogy. So the first book came out last year. That's Legend of the Quill. And this was the deluxe special edition that came out for it. And then the second book comes out in March, and that is Battle of Heroes, is my proof copy. But it is a kind of taking a lot of the tropes from the classic, epic fantasy genre and turning them on their head. So we have an reluctant chosen one for our protagonist, but it is an ensemble cast. And their goal in the first book is to try and resurrect the hero that they need to save them, which is a mage who has been dead for 800 years. So yeah, it's quite a sprawling epic. There are a lot of cultures, a lot of languages. So if you're the fan of conlangs and maps and all of that good stuff, then that's where it's at.
That speaks to my heart because I am a Tolkien
Yes.
pure. I don't want to say purist because I love the reinvention of fantasy. I think is so important. But I love how Tolkien dives in 100%. And I cut my teeth in fantasy with the Chronicles of Narnia, which honestly, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was not my favorite. It was The Horse and His Boy, and where they really get into kind of the worlds around Narnia. And I was like, oh my God, this is huge. And then getting into The Lord of the Rings later, I was like, I love being able to completely immerse myself in something, which is kind of how we started having a conversation on Threads that led to our conversation here. Was about world building and how you can build an immersive world. And so much of that never ends up on page. And you have a lot of work set in the same world. So you have a lot of opportunities to eventually add things in and build that flavor. So when you started your project the first time, how did you start building your world out?
The very first seed for this one was actually for Legend of the Quill. I shelved it for 25 years because I knew I needed to learn more about the world before I could tell this story well.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, a friend came back from England and brought me a quill and some ink, and I was testing it out and wrote, "In my death, I sign Adarok." And I was like, who's this person? And so that was the jiving in point, was with this person. And this trilogy is really ancient history for this world. So it was the kind of the explanation for why the world is the way it is now. Firstborn, which was my first novel, was actually modern day for them. And I have written another book that I'll probably be putting out after The Prophet's Tale is done, which is also a modern day in the same country that this one starts in, but almost 1,000 years later. So with that came this understanding of, okay, well, how does this world work? And like, who are these people, the different cultures? How do they interplay with each other? This is a world that doesn't have any humans. So they're all their own species, and there are kind of two main continents. There's other islands and things, but the two main continents, the East, were the ones that kind of evolved from various species. So rather than just being humans, they evolved from different animals. And so for them, like, that meant that they had different capabilities, they had different morals, they had different social structures. And then the ones in the West, which is where this story starts, are actually crossbreeds of those original races that the gods tampered with to create their own people. And so, there was a lot of different like cultural overlaps. And one of the things that I was looking at really closely was, if you have more than one sapient species on a planet, how will that change how interplay works, whether that's in diplomacy or warfare or even just technological advancement? And because the different species have different capabilities, that limited what they could or couldn't do. So there are some species that are much better with magic and some that don't believe in it at all. And so that really shapes how their societies function and also how trade works. So if you believe in magic but can't do it very well, then you might trade with a country that's really good at it, and that's one of their exports. And so the accessibility of magic in this world really stunted a lot of technological pieces that we would consider. So looking at that kind of timeline where I talk about, crossing over 1,000 years, some of the developments that we might expect, like they didn't have the sort of industrial revolution in the same way that we did. They don't have a lot of firearms because they're so expensive to maintain, and you'd have to like waste bullets and things. Why not?
Why use that when you could use a projectile spell? Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So that really changed the trajectory of it. But this trilogy is about how even that sustainable magic system, where it is a sustainable resource, can be abused. And they use way too much magic. They break the balance of the world, and they go into a fall where the realms start to collapse. And it's really a question for them of like, okay, well, if we're going to use this, how do we use it sustainably? Who has access? And so that changes kind of the interplay with magic. So yeah, it was just like a labor of love. And I mean, when I say I took a 25-year break, I was still working on the world, whether that was in short story. I built a whole tabletop RPG so that I could better understand the magic system. So there was all of that kind of building that was going into it so that when I came back to it this time, I was able to tell it accurately.
I love that you said you took a 25-year break, because I did something similar with my series. I started writing it when I was a young teen, and then picked it back up now in my late 30s ish. And whenever I took that break, for me it was I love that you said you built like a tabletop RPG, because for me I dived into research and how would things work, and what are societies like, and so I put out like my main novel and 2 novellas, and a friend of mine was like, wow, how are you writing all this? I was like, well, I've written it years ago. I'm just now polishing it for the first time. And I think that's so important when we're, as a writer, is that we do take the time to explore the worlds that we're building, and not just assume that people will understand it, that we have to understand it first before we can explain it to somebody. Which is, I guess, kind of wanted me to lead into when you design your cultures, you talked about bringing them from, and this I love, is that you start from like evolutionarily, like what would a society need? Like I'm assuming when you talk about evolutionarily and animals that they would have come from, is like you've got, what is predator-prey relationship like in an evolving species? What are these things? How does all of that lean into what we would see in sort of the modern day setting of the daily lives of these characters?
Yeah. Let's go for a couple of specific examples so that I'm not just speaking in vague generalities. So one of the species in the world is the Sorro. They evolved from a type of forest cat, kind of similar to a fossa. And for them, I mean, the species that they evolved from were very communal. They had almost like a bonobo structure with a lot of sexual contact. There a lot of social grooming, a lot of grace and elegance. So when that evolves out, you have cultures where pleasure houses and bath houses are just accessible to everyone because it's such an important part of their culture, where they're a lot more free with their sexuality because of that. They're a lot more polyamorous in their social structures because of that. And for them, it's so much about appearances. It's become this very kind of it has its faults as well, because they are very ageist, they are very ableist, because it's like everything has to be perfect, and they train you on how to let the light love you. And so for them, you have a lot of these aspects of they recognize 3 genders. They have very high expectations on like how you conduct yourself, and like if you make a faux pas of like scraping your knife on your plate in public, like change your name, move countries. Like I'm exaggerating, but it does kind of filter down through everything from their fashion, their cuisine, their faith. They have probably the most open faith. They have like 4 different pantheons, and you can believe in any or none of the gods. Like they're a lot more accessible in that sense, because they recognize that people are different, and so it's not about being the same. It's not about homogenizing and like for our fashion industry of like trying to aim for a sample size where your genetics might not line up with that beauty standard. And instead, what does your beauty look like? How can you make yourself the best version of you? So for them, they have this kind of very elaborate very complex way of communicating with each other, with a lot of nonverbal and a lot of like implied social contracts. And that ties in with like how their money works. Like anything less than basically like $30 is considered gauche. And so they have like a credit system where you have a social credit where you're like, well, this is who I am and this bank can vouch for me. And so you have this kind of understanding that you just have your reputation that kind of pays your way to an extent. Their closest neighbor is Sparitan. That's one of the kind of villains in this first book. And they evolved from bears who are extremely territorial. And they are also polyamorous, but for them, it's like men will have multiple wives. And that means they have a surplus of men. And so a lot of the men, when they're young, if they're not considered strong enough, masculine enough, then they will sell them to the cutters and they'll be made into eunuchs, which are basically indentured servants. So they have their country that they live in is very swampy, very boggy, it's very wet, and they are the most colonialist of any of the cultures in the world, where they have throughout the centuries tried to conquer various nations. And part of that is that, like, well, this is the land you have to work with. Like, it's not necessarily like the coziest place to call home. So we'll reach a bit. We'll try and take that person's land, that person's resources. And part of that tied in for them is that they are extremely zealots in their faith. And for them, they believe that their pantheon is the best pantheon. It's not that they don't believe in other ones, but they think that theirs are the true and first gods that built the world. And so they are trying to convert people, and they are trying to teach people the right way of doing things, as opposed to the Sorro, who are like, well, there are many ways of being perfect. It's just what makes sense for you. And so
as long as you're perfect, you can do it anyway.
Yeah. If you can do it with style, then they'll let a lot slide. Whereas the Sparitanians are very rigid of like, this is the correct way to be, and this is why society functions. And if you don't adhere to that, then you are a malcontent to society. So they're neighbors, and there's a lot of conflict, but they're also the two most powerful nations in the world, and so they've kept each other in check. So the Sorro are really good at magic. The Sparitanians are the strongest people in the world, like physically. And so if they can get their hands on a Sorro, they'll snap them easily. But the Sorro is like, well, I want to keep my distance and see some illusions and hide myself.
Play it in smart ways, yeah.
Yeah, and they have kept each other in check. So they're very different people, and they have very different values, but they balance each other out. And that's a kind of running theme with that one culture might get an upper hand for a bit, but that's not something you can sustain when you have all of these other nations around who are like, that could be us next. So yeah, it's a delicate power play.
I like that, because you can see logically how you've built the societal structures based off of like bears being territorial. Obviously, that's going to lead into a colonial mindset where you're going to go out and take more territory, because if there's a surplus of men, there's only so much land you can control. You got to get out there and get more, and especially if your land is not desirable. But then also how it lends to social evolution as well, because if you've got two major players like that keeping everyone else in check, you suddenly begin to see how they're going to change and adapt to one another, and how that changes all of the smaller cultures around them. So I think it's such a cool way to really write out sort of these complex social situations and complex world building tools that give you a logical basis to start from and continue to build from. That's top tier.
And honestly, the biggest thing for me, like anyone I talk to about world building, and I've done like panels and workshops on it, is the what if, right? Like if they are bears, then what does that mean? Like they have litters, so you have a lot of children. How many of them live? It's that complete domino effect of, if this is true, then how does this other piece work? And that's something that I find really enriching, because it gives you the opportunity to kind of look at human cultures around the world and be like, does it have to be this way? Why is it
Absolutely.
this way? And that's something that philosophers have been talking about forever. But I think that fantasy is a really exciting way to explore those things, so that hopefully readers kind of come back and start looking at things that they've taken for granted differently.
I completely agree. I know with like sci-fi has always been the one people throw out a lot about, like, oh yeah, sci-fi shows us without saying this group is wrong and this group is right, the way that we can interact with each other better. But I think fantasy does such a good job as well of showing us that things can be so alien to us, but can still show us exactly where we're at as a society, that everyone ultimately has the same human struggle. It's just learning to see one another through the lens or the eye of a different type of character. And that's the way we should be viewing one another in daily life as well. Speaking of daily life, when we talk about societies like this, what would you say, like, what is the daily life of one of your characters like? If they were not in the story, what would society shape a daily, sort of 9 to 5 experience?
It really depends on the culture, because there are, all these different cultures throughout the world. The book that I have, like the Firstborn, the one that came out first, is in a country called Muzin. It's one of the neighbors of Sorro and Sparitan. And that is a very small scale, single person, boy next door, day in the life. And it is, for him, like, he lives in a barter system. Their species has extremely good memories. They remember like things on a long timeline into high detail. So they don't have a coin system, like a dollar system at all. They use barter. So you do this favor for me, I'll do this favor for your neighbor does something for you, and we're all even. And so for him, he does pretty much odd jobs. He's not like anything fancy or special, but he is cursed. He's born with a curse. And for him, if he stays in one place too long, then that curse starts to affect the people he cares about. And so he has to kind of keep moving. And for a lot of the pieces that he deals with, it's like, he's loading and unloading a ship. He's acting as a bodyguard for a caravan that's doing some trade. So it's not anything like exciting or fancy in that sense, but it is the kind of cogs that keep the country running. Like, how do you get the wine? Well, we've got to bring it in, and this is the person who's doing that job. So I do have some stories, especially with some of my short stories, where I deal with more of the kind of like the quiet, NPCs of the world who are just keeping things running. But I do want glimpses of that to be seen even in the epics, where you have like these heroes, who are supporting them and who are like keeping things going, and who are they fighting for. So yeah, there are different social structures, and depending on where you fall in them, your day is going to look very different. But I would say that for the most part, there is, in general, throughout the world, a higher appreciation for sustainability, both in like the natural world and the balance of how that plays in with their metropolises, but also for the interplay of like past and present. So carrying forward those traditions, either for good or for ill, and also for working with other people. So there's a lot more collaboration and a lot more expectation that you can kind of rely on your community. And so there is like, it's less of like an insular sort of experience of you're just working your 9 to 5 kind of thing, and it's like separate from the cogs of the machine. Whereas for them, it's a lot more like, well, that's the tanner, that's what he does. That's the cobbler, that's what she does. So there is more of a kind of thing of an expectation that you kind of hold a role, that you are reliable, that you do contribute in some way. But what that contribution looks like really depends on the person.
And we talked a little bit about this before, about you mentioned that there was just less divisiveness and less division within the world building that you have. And if you could go into a little bit more about how, because you mentioned that in terms of like, what about the world would shock us, and like how different it would be. And so that, to me, I think the more you talk about it, the more I would love to hear more about like how that lack of division helps to build this cohesive story in a way that is fresh and new and shocking to a reader.
I think there's 2 parts to it. And one is that you mentioned it earlier of like everyone's human. Because these aren't humans, one of the things that I really dig into is the different like values that these different species have. So the Fedorians, who's the main kind of species in the Prophet's Tale, the protagonist, Sashar, is a Fedorian. They're known as peacekeepers, and they are the closest kind of analog to humans physically, like in their physiognomy. But they are just generally more collaborative, more peacekeeping. Like their goal is to ensure that people have what they need. Their goal is to ensure that there is stability. And I think that in that sense, like they're very different from humans, because what their motivation is not necessarily going to be the same. There's not that same kind of capitalist drive of like, well, you have to have more than everybody else. And part of that comes from their history. They were originally like 6 different warring provinces, and they were like, this is not, we're killing our own people. Why are we doing this? And that interplay as well of having different species is that you have more of a sense of like us versus them for some cultures, where it's like you have a very visible difference where you're like, this is our people and those are not our people. And so that doesn't just extend to like, the aesthetics and like who can breed, but also from a standpoint of, if you are a very weak species, you just may not be able to survive in a culture where everyone is super strong. Like you just can't keep up. And there are certainly some extraordinary people who are like, I'm going to find a way. But it does mean that there is kind of a little bit more segregation in the nations of like who lives there. You might work and trade and travel through, but you're not necessarily going to be able to survive there long term. So that also creates more of a sense of like, well, we are a community, we are people, like we understand each other, we should work together. But then on the other side of it, so there's like the moral side of things, but the other side and the danger that I think some people have when they don't dig very deep in their world building is having it all just be a monolith where everybody from this culture is the same. And that's something that I really want to avoid, because within cultures you have different groups. You have they have some, like some of them have some pretty nasty history with like prejudices against specific groups within their culture. There's also religious differences, which I talked about, where it's not necessarily just because you're of this species you have this faith or this belief. And there's also different regions, so different regional dialects or regional cuisines, or different because of the biome being different, that your lifestyle is just going to be different from your own people who are from a different region. And so on the one side, you want to explore, okay, if they're not human, what do they value and how does that shape their motivations and their choices? But on the other side, like just because this one person had this experience doesn't mean that they're going to be the same as somebody else from their own culture that's from a different place and has had different opportunities or different traumas. So yeah, for me, it's very much that piece of trying to balance those two things, because I want the stories to be accessible to humans. I'm aware that my readers are human and they're going to, no matter how much they try, bring a human lens to it. But I'm hoping that I can kind of crack that door open a little wider and be like, okay, but consider how that could be different. Consider what these motivations could look like. And so sometimes that translates into telling the kinds of stories that don't often get told, whether that's, a strong protagonist who is strong because they can keep their cool under difficult circumstances rather than gonna stab somebody because they're a badass, right? Like I want to kind of show different ways that you can have a hero who doesn't necessarily fit the mold of what our expectations of the genre have shaped.
I genuinely love that, because when I write, so much of what I write comes from human mythology and historical mythology. And one of the pieces that I research constantly is how in the Victorian era, in our own history, we added so much Greek mythology into what wouldn't have been Greek mythology before. And it changes the story structure of the way that Germanic or Asian literature and mythology and folklore worked. And so we have this now universal hero's journey that was not universal at the time that these stories were told or written, or insert the culture that they came from, how they kept storytelling. And so when you're talking about like how we tell different stories, you're putting people into a different lens where they have to question what is the accepted version of the hero's journey. So I love that. I genuinely that speaks to me as a reader, and it speaks to me as a researcher and as an author. When you began to write your characters and you began to think of how everyone interacted and how the story was going to fit into the world that you've built, was there any one character that sort of surprised you in the way that they did or didn't fit into the storytelling?
There are a couple. So for this one, it's quite a big cast. It's an ensemble cast. There are 7 heroes and 7 villains. And the ones that surprised me are the ones that I was surprised at how much I enjoyed writing them. So 2 of the villains, one of them is Antir. He's a necromancer. He's disgusting. And I just got to use so many fun words writing him. Like he's sniveling and he's obsequious and he's just like, he's this horrible old man. Anyways, but he is one that I get kind of the most commentary on, because I think he is, in a lot of ways, he is quite shocking. And he's a heretic. So there are there are 10 different schools of magic, and that they are able to achieve different things. They work in different ways. And necromancy falls under the realm of esoterics, which is the healing magics. So we have one of our heroes he's a threnodist, he's a healer. And then we have this necromancer who is basically subverting that same magic and using it to very different ends. And so he was kicked out of the school where he was studying because of kind of taking the magic in directions it's illegal to go. But because of that, like some of the ways that it works, it's the interplay of body, soul, and mind, and how do you thread them together, and how do you transfer energy from one to the other. And that can be used for good or ill. So he was really fun to write because it was a subversion of something that is established in the world, but you meet him before you meet the threnodist. So you meet you kind of encounter the wrong way of doing it before you encounter the right way of doing it. And so that was really fun to kind of explore, because as the reader is coming in and who's new to this, you're just believing that everything is true as you go forward, because that's what you're being given and what you're being told. So there's kind of this shock to like the way that this magic can be used before you see like what it's supposed to be for. And that like what it's supposed to be for really comes into play in the second book. And there's that kind of battle between them of trying to save these souls that are being subverted and destroyed. So that was one. The other one is Anya. She is a healer. Technically, she's the villain's healer, and she is the best. She is the best healer that the world has ever seen, and she is absolutely destroyed by it. So when we meet her, she is very sick with what's called mana sickness. If you use too much magic, it just like eats through you. And depending on the kind of magic you're using, the symptoms will change. In her case, she's been trying to keep herself young because her son has gone missing, and she's waiting for him to come home. She wants like no time to have passed. And in the second book, she kind of gets to meet him again, and by then she's just this like prematurely aged. Like she's probably only in her 40s, but she looks like she's closer to 70. She's like her skin is like sagging off her body. Her mind is absolutely shattered. It's really hard to communicate with her because you only get pieces of cognizance in her, but she still knows all the plants and all the healing like remedies. So it's this person who is so powerful, and that power has absolutely like destroyed her and eaten through. And she's kind of a cautionary tale for our protagonist, because he's abusing magic, and this is what he has to look forward to. This is what he will become if he doesn't like stop it, and he can't because the world is expecting so much from him that he's being kind of forced into destroying himself to save them. So yeah, those two were really eye-opening for me, and they were really fun to write because their voices were just so strong and so different from the general narrative tone. Those ones I think I learned a lot from.
That's really cool. I do love the idea of magic that costs something. And typically I feel like when you do see a world building piece like that, like where magic costs something, it means that it's finite. But you've mentioned several times in our pre-conversations and in this conversation as well, that magic is a renewable resource. Can you tell me a little bit more about where magic comes from and how it is renewed within the system?
So the world is made up of realms, and the different realms kind of generate certain types of magic. But there are two main forms of it. So the Manoweave is what everyone is drawing. Existence is Manoweave. It exists because it has physical form. It has been bound together. So that's trees, rocks, people, the events that have been chosen in history. And then on the other side of that, you have Huskine, which is all of the choices that didn't happen. Everything that kind of was cut off too soon, all of the possibilities in between that haven't been chosen. There's a lot more Huskine than there is of Manoweave, but it's like cobweb versus rivers. And so they two do balance each other out in general power, but that delicate balance will cause some problems if it comes out of whack. Because if you have too much mana, too much that's in weave that is formed and it is solid, things become too rigid, and they start to break down, progress stalls. If you have too much Huskine, everything is possible, but nothing is tangible. Like that's where you get into hallucination and madness. So the two of them are necessary, but you have to be careful of balance. So the main realm that everything takes place on, the Earth realm, the Ul-Zaorith, it is the perfect balance, 50% of each. But as you go higher up in the realms, there's more and more Manoweave. And as you go farther down in the realms, there's more and more Huskine. And so the characters do get to kind of explore or kind of pass through some of those realms in the course of the story. And you get to see how, if you throw that balance off, you end up with very different laws of reality. And for the interplay of them, if you have a choice that you make, that Huskine becomes Manoweave. It transforms into Manoweave. As somebody dies, they break apart and come back into husk. So you have that kind of eternal cycle where things can move in and out of those two forms depending on how they're used, whether that's manually through magic or through the act of living. The problem is when you have, like, for example, in the second book, The Battle of Heroes, it is the Battle of Heroes. There's a huge death toll because you've got all of this magic being used in a really confined space and so many lives being taken in such a short amount of time that it completely throws that balance out of whack. In the same way that if you have like new gods springing up, that's a huge amount of concentrated power. And if you have too much of that happening, in this case in the West, versus all of the established pantheons in the East, it again throws that balance out of whack. So it typically is something that only lasts for kind of like a lifetime if you're casting magic. Like when a caster dies, whatever magic they cast that's still around, most magic is kind of instantaneous, but there are forms that have more lasting effects, like enchantments and runes and charms and things. Those would break down. So one of the things, and it hasn't come up in any of these books because these happened beforehand, and Muzin is illiterate, so they don't use books. But I have short stories where I've explored one of the forms of books is that they have is what they call ephemera books, and they're basically just blank book blocks. They're very simple. They're very inexpensively made, and you would just pay an enchanter to copy whatever book it is you want onto those blank pages, and it'll last as long as that enchanter's around. So it's known that when you buy them, it's like, oh, it's got 15 years left on it before this person is probably likely to croak it. So enjoy it while you can. And then you just take your blank book back once it fades to the bookbinder to have them put a new book into the same book block that you have. So there are things like that where it's like expected that there is kind of a lifespan for it before it'll expire. And it's only rarely that you'll have an artifact where the magic is so powerfully woven that even when the caster dies, it doesn't unravel, it doesn't evaporate. But those people are like very, very rare. They very rarely happen, and they often, when they live, cause a lot of problems. Like our great mage, who starts off this trilogy, definitely casts some magic that lasted 800 years after he died, and that's part of what kind of kickstarts all of these tragedies into happening. So, yeah, it's intended to be that kind of cyclical experience, but that requires people to be conscientious of how they're using it. It requires people to allow things to have a natural ending. And when people try and prevent that or extend that is when you run into problems.
That makes sense for several characters that you even talked about as well, that they would explain their motivations. Because I think about like, you have the very colonial species there that like, obviously they need to be kept in check because obviously if too many people die in conquest, then things go out of balance with the weave. And but then also you've got like all of your characters, again, like the plot line of the book that you're I believe you said it's coming out this year, or it's out, the first one's already out.
Yeah, the first one came out last March. The second one comes out March 26th.
March 26th. So we're getting close to the release date on that one. That's exciting. But that you see that the plot lines rely on the structure of how the magic works. And you mentioned two things I thought when you were talking I was curious about the gods and goddesses, because you do mention that there are multiple pantheons. A lot of times I feel like that religion is something that gets glossed over because it's an uncomfortable conversation in reality, and people are unsure or whatever. And then so it gets translated into fiction that it's an uncomfortable conversation, or it becomes an all or nothing situation. Like the gods are real, everyone believes in them. In your societies and in your world with these multiple pantheons, are there gods that are real, or are there gods that are not real, or is there some mixture of both? Or can you talk a little more about that?
There's definitely a mixture of both. It depends on the people. So there are gods that are dead. They were real once, they're gone now, but the people who still worship them still worship them. And sometimes other gods from other pantheons will kind of be like, all right, I'll answer that prayer. And so it's enough to make them believe that their gods are still around and still with them. There are other pantheons where they are very much like they walk among people in disguise, and there are demigods who are born of like mortal and god pairings. One of the characters in book 3 of this trilogy is technically one of those. Then there are also ones who were mortal once and just had amassed so much power and so much belief that they ascended and became gods. And then there are like amorphous forces that are not personified, but definitely have power. And for some, there's one culture that they kind of take these as patrons and they tap into them, and they know that they're not people, but they're still a power source, and they can still draw forth from that. And it's not from prayer, but it's from ritual. And then there are other people who don't have gods at all, and either they don't believe in them. There's a species, the same species who doesn't believe in magic, also doesn't have gods, but they do believe in reincarnation, right? So for them, it's like, yeah, there's energy, and we are energy, and we can go through these cycles, but they don't believe in it being divine. So yeah, there's a lot of different types of gods, and that's like largely because of different peoples have different beliefs and different interplay with them. There's one species who were gods once and came down and became mortal, and it's given them some lasting problems. Like, they're the most powerful at magic, but they also have a really hard time conceiving, so they have a really tiny population. So yeah, there are definitely a lot of different types of deities. There's hundreds of them in the world, but it's not, as I said, not a monolith. So you're going to have some people who are like, well, this god is my patron god. And you're going to have some people who are like, I believe in the pantheon in general, and during the festivals, I will give offerings. And then you have people who are doing like full on, like, human sacrifices to their gods. It really depends on the area of the world. It depends on the time period in which the story takes place. And it also depends on how active those gods are in their lives. Because there are definitely some who are more fond of people and spend more time like interacting and answering prayers and sending visions and generally taking their favorites. And then you have some that are kind of more standoffish, or like, it's not, I will handle the heavens, I will work in the realms, but that's up to mortals to deal with what's happening on the earth realm. So yeah, it's really fun to kind of explore it. I do have some gods in the first in these trilogies, and one of the villains is one of the gods who decides to get involved in the war, and he's a problem. So yeah, it's fun because like there are gods that are like manifest and can communicate with mortals, and so that shapes belief as well. If you have somebody who shows up, then it's easier to kind of be like, well, he said this, and that's who he is, rather than it being like, well, I have a book that I found in a cave, and it's true. But you definitely have, like, again, because you have different pantheons in different cultures, there are gods wars. So there was a gods war that happened before this trilogy, like ages ago. And because of it, there is a truce between the gods and the demons where they're not allowed to directly interfere. So they've left kind of artifacts for their followers to like tap into their power, but they're not supposed to directly step into the mortal affairs themselves. And so we are now in an era where we rely on heroes because the gods aren't supposed to. They're on truce. They're not supposed to interfere. And of course, one of the demons is like, well, I'm going to interfere. So breaks that truce a bit. But yeah, so it does depend on kind of the time period, but I do want to play with those pieces because I don't want them to just be like, we'll use it in like an oath, you often see that in fantasy. It's like comes up and like, oh, by the light, or whatever the kind of phrase is, but you don't really see any sort of like actual impact on their daily life of whether that's prayer or ritual or superstition, like all of those pieces. And they show up in very small ways, except for, the gods themselves show up a lot of the time in my stories. But this trilogy, because it is my big epic, they actually do have quite an impact on the story. And there are a few of them that kind of get to speak in their own words.
I love that. I mean, I genuinely, religion is one of my favorite topics in general, especially when you're building a world, because I do agree that there's so much we see just especially living in the West, that that religion affects so much of our moral system. It affects so much of our daily lives and why we believe, something's right or wrong, or we believe even why we should do things around certain times of the year. Like religion comes into play a lot into that. And so when we talk about like how religion affects the daily life of in a fantasy world, there are so many more things. Like they're not going to have anything that might be analogous to Christmas because they don't have, the same solstice. They don't have the same cues. They don't have the same religious situations where, you would end up with that. And then, so like, there's so much ways that you end up telling these stories where the religion informs the culture. And that kind of leads me into, or back around to, we talked about like, what would the daily life of a character be like, and who supports the system outside of like the big, the heroes of the book. Is when you're writing your stories, you write epics and you have like short stories and novellas and things like that. Do you feel like you get to write more of sort of the cogs in the wheel story in your short stories, or do you feel like some of that comes out more in the conversation and the exposition in your epics?
I think like for a part of the reason I put this trilogy aside for so long is because I was too excited about the world, and so I was doing too much digression into but this cool thing, and that's something that I think is a big pitfall for people who are writing second world fantasy, because you want to explain it to your reader, and if you just stop and give them a diatribe of like, well, did you know, then it really takes you out of the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I do find that short stories give me an avenue where I can just pick one thing and focus on it and be like, let's do a story around this one bit, and that allows you to kind of dive into some of those neat details that don't really have a place in a larger narrative, or don't have the space for that digression in a larger narrative. But I think it's one of those things where it should be felt. It should exist in the context of the world, and I have that noticeable in the conversations. Like, again, there are phrases and things that people might say that are tied in with things. There are kind of superstitious gestures that people will make if someone speaks in a way that is blasphemous. There are definitely festivals that happen that are sacred to certain things. In the book that I want to put out after this one, which is written, it's just waiting for a better publishing date, is Briar and Thorn. It is a smaller story, but there is a lot of interplay with faith in that one, because the protagonist gets pregnant out of wedlock, and so she gets sent to a convent, and so she's raised by these priestesses, and they are each wing of the convent is for a different goddess. And so she's learning a lot more about these things that she had only ever lived in the secular world. You would hire one, you would go to the temple and you give offerings during the festival once a year, but it wasn't something that really affected her life on a larger scale. And now she's having to kind of like dive into this, and she's not taken orders. She's just there for her convalescence. And it's like, okay, well, how much of this do you want to embrace? Do you want to become a nun, or do you want to like take this little bit of magic that they're teaching you back into the real world? So I think that, it depends on either if it's the focus of the story, like it is in Briar and Thorn, where like that was a big part of the narrative, or is it if it's something that is just should be felt around the edges, but it's not where the camera's pointing. Like all of those pieces are important in the world building and certainly in the developmental stage, but I think that you kind of have to have a focus. So you can't like try and do all of it in one book, or it's going to be a bit hard for a reader to follow. Yeah. So for me, it's like I have some books where you've got like a direct interaction with the gods. I've got other books where it's a more subtle piece. I've got other ones where it is more of an exploration of the theology around it. But I wouldn't try and do all of those in one story.
That makes a lot of sense. What would you say is the best book for someone to kind of get started into learning the world building?
For this one, I mean, I usually recommend Firstborn just because it is a standalone. It is a smaller book. It is very self-contained. It only deals with like 3 of the nations of the world, so it is, and primarily one. But it is also a dark fantasy, so it is dealing with kind of harder themes. There is more kind of like murder and abuse happening in that one, so it depends on if that's your taste. Legend of the Quill is like the foundation of the world. So this trilogy is very much like the foundation for the books that I want to write after, because I have a bunch more that are drafted that I want to kind of get around to finishing. If you like crunchy world building, if you like a really rich setting where you can dig into like glossaries and different cultures and epic journeys, then this one is a good one. So like if you are a fan of Tolkien, then this trilogy is probably a good place. And then if you want something that's more romantic, Briar and Thorn, which is the convent one, which will be coming out next, is probably going to be a good place for something that is like a queer romance. So and that one is just deals with one culture. There's like a couple references to other cultures that you would recognize from reading The Prophet's Tale, but it is very self-contained. It is very much like just regular people and not any sort of like heroes or epics or gods. So yeah, I think it depends on what your taste is, but my goal is to kind of write a little bit of something for everybody.
I like that. Like I said before, I'm a huge Tolkien fan, so I want that crunchy, like I need an appendix to get through something. Is like, that makes me so happy. If I need a pronunciation guide and an appendix, I'm there.
I include glossaries in my book, so all of them kind of have a glossary, and I do illustrations as well to try to like give a bit more context to the world, so you can see some of the like creatures and items and things that are happening in the story. And those are kind of pieces that I've done for all of my books, because like that's what I love. When I find a fantasy book that has like maps and illustrations and like all of that good stuff, like I want to sink in and feel transported, and so that's what the kind of feeling that I want to give with my books as well.
That's great. When is there other books that you want to write outside of this series?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Because I know there's always like I always explain it like there are stories that live inside of me, and I'll say I've got 3 main stories inside of me in 3 different settings. But right now I'm telling the one. Do you feel like you have a lot of different stories inside of you that exist outside of this, or is there kind of some main 1 or 2 big ones?
I mean, there's kind of 2 pieces. Ul-Zaorith is my baby. I love it. I'm obsessed with it. And I could keep writing books in it forever. After this trilogy, I do have a duology. Again, it's already drafted. I would just need to go back and edit it. That happens after. So this trilogy is about prophecy. It's about these kind of stories that we're told are going to happen inevitably. And so the protagonist for this trilogy is a prophet, and he is kind of the most far-seeing prophet that the world has ever had. And he sees kind of what's coming. So he sees the problem that they have made, and he's like, we have to fix this. We've ruined everything. We have to fix it. This can't be our legacy. And so the duology that comes after this is his prophecy coming true down the road. And then after that, I have a series of what I refer to as the Circle series. So it's 9 books that are interlocked, where they're all standalone, but the protagonist from each one, or protagonists, in the case there's a couple that have two, they show up as a kind of cameo in the book that precedes and a book that follows. So you can start anywhere on the circle, and they all have different tones. Each one is set in one of the countries in the East, so the 9 different nations there, and they deal with they're all happening concurrently, but they deal with different issues. So one of them is a kind of a Sophoclean trial. One of them is a like operatic romance. One of them is a resurrection of a deposed country that is trying to regain their freedom. So yeah, they all have very different tones, but that's like a kind of dream kind of place to get to with this world. And then Briar and Thorn kind of happened. I don't know where it came from. It wasn't one of the ones I had planned. It just like showed up and needed to be told. And so that's all the like Ul-Zaorith stuff. I also have like half-baked cookbooks and obviously the tabletop RPG that I would love to finish up someday, and fables and things like that. I love a field guide. So like maybe someday I'll put together a field guide of just like different like creatures and places. So that's all of like the Ul-Zaorith stuff. But I also have worlds for every genre that I love. So I have like different formats. I used to do comics, and so some of it is like more visual storytelling. And so I have like a different setting for each of the genres that I love. And I have books, some written in them. So I have like some urban fantasy. I have paranormal mystery. So I have these kind of different stories, but they're more settings that I like to play in, but they don't have like necessarily strict narratives. So these ones are like specific stories that I want to tell, whereas those ones are are places I like to play. And sometimes that takes the form of role play, because I'll use them as a setting for role play. But occasionally I'll do like I have a short story, or I have a specific comic or something that I want to tell in those worlds. And so they're a nice outlet when I need to like step away or like brainstorm or think about other pieces. But I don't know what I'm going to do with them yet. So like I have them, but I haven't focused on like from a publishing perspective as much with what to do with those stories. Maybe someday I will branch out and also publish them as well. But for now, my focus is definitely in the second world fantasy.
That it makes a lot of sense, because the way that it seems like that you write and that you build, you complete something before you start it, and I think that's like I can see where you like going to play in those places is part of the completion process, of part of the world building process. It's almost like the test lab of like, does the story work?
Well, and also I think sometimes like I'll have like a bunch of characters running around, but it's like, whose story do I tell? So I did one a couple years ago. I wrote an urban fantasy, and it's got like witches and shifters and that sort of thing. And for that one, it was very much like I had this huge cast of characters that exist in it, from like, you know, different creatures that they turn into, and the way that the different covens work and the pacts that they make with demons. But it was one of those things of like, which characters do I focus on? Like whose story do I want to tell, and where in their kind of arc do I want to start and finish that story? And so that was kind of the bigger challenge, was figuring out like, how do I distill this into this snapshot moment in time, rather than, you know, just letting people kind of create a character within that world and play it in a like a forum RPG. So yeah, it's sometimes like I find like some of the stories I probably would never write novels for, because they deserve a different format. Like I have one that will be an illustrated like short story collection, where it's going to be closer to a graphic novel, I would say, than text. And that one's one where I'm like, I don't think I have the skill yet to tell it the way I want to tell it. So I'm kind of been brainstorming and backburnering it until I feel like I can tackle it head on. But yeah, so some of them I'm like, I don't have the technique to do it. Like whether it's, you know, this would be a great video game, but I don't do video games. So some of the stories, they need a certain format that is not necessarily in my wheelhouse to do. So they're there. But in the meantime, like doing the Ul-Zaorith books is like, I can do the illustrations, I can do the writing, I can do them justice. And so they're something that's easier to sink into.
Absolutely. And I guess kind of last question, what inspires you to build your world? Like, is there a series that you just, when you were maybe a kid, that you read that you were like, I want to do this for the rest of my life?
I think I've been reading since I was very small. I would read my mom bedtime stories when I was a kid, because I was like, you have to do voices. And for me, at the moment, like I loved storytelling, and I loved fable, and I loved fantasy, and like all of those things. But I think the moment where when I first read a book where I was like, oh, I could do this, was probably the Eternal Champion series by Michael Moorcock. Because it is just so weird. It's just, there's so many things in it where you're like, oh, there's no, like, at no point does he stop and explain or justify or anything. It's just like weird stuff happens, and you're like, this is cool. And then he just moves on. And so that one was for kind of the one that started me writing novels, because up until then I've been doing comics. And then I think that most recently the ones that have really kind of gobsmacked me were N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy, which is just an absolute masterclass. And most recently was one I read last year, that is The City in Glass by Niveau. There were just like, if I was a literature professor, I would break that book down, because there are so many throwaway lines about cool things that she just like drops, and then you're like, what was that? That was super. What was that thing? It's like one line and it's the whole story. Yeah. So that kind of stuff. I love ones where you can kind of see a glimpse of a whole other world, and they only give you a taste of it, and I want to crack that door open and really just like roll around and like just completely immerse myself in these like alien places. So yeah, those are some of the ones that I've found were quite inspiring for me.
I'm actually reading the 5th season now, and she does a lot of things like that, where she'll do this little drop of conversation and doesn't follow up on it until much later.
Yeah.
And I think it's important. It's such a great way to kind of subvert the tropes that we expect in fantasy, because a lot of them are still there, but they're not what we would expect them to come out at us at. And so I think those are great examples of how you can be inspired by something so different from your own genre, but it still inspires you to subvert the tropes and really to kind of turn things on their head while still giving readers what they know that they want, because they want fantasy or they want sci-fi or, and insert genre that they're looking for. I guess so to close us out, can you tell us how someone might find your books, and if you have a website or anything like that, if they want to get in contact with you?
I do. I have a website. It is www.astracrompton.com. And I have my books on there as well. Right now, the deluxe edition for book one is sold out. But I am doing a couple of giveaways right now in the promo for the second book for Battle of Heroes. So right now, Battle of Heroes is on NetGalley until March 31st. So if people wanted to review it, I would recommend that they read Legend of the Quill first, because it's a lot of world building to chew off if you're diving in midway through the trilogy. But if you do reviews for Legend of the Quill or Battle of Heroes before the end of April, then you'll be entered in the draw for a bundle that has the deluxe editions for book 1 and 2. It's got a themed tee. It's got some art from myself, as well as some like stickers and keychains and goodies. So that one is open till April 30th. And there's one for the ARC readers for Battle of Heroes, and there's another one for the reviewers for books 1 and 2. So those are kind of the things that are happening right now. My social media is on my website as well. I am mostly on Threads and Instagram these days. And then I also have a mailing list. So I give out goodies like preview on stuff that's happening. I did a short story that dropped in December that was a necromancer short story. So that's probably the best place to follow and to find out what new things are coming, because there's always something new.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Astra, for joining me here on our, I guess, world building conversation.
Yes.
I had so much fun hearing about your story and learning about the world. And I have to say, I'm super inspired now to go out and do a lot more writing and digging in and clarifying within my own stories. So thank you so much. I'm HF Day, and if you like what you heard, feel free to like, subscribe, follow, and go and be sure that you follow Astra Crompton on especially her mailing list. It sounds like that's going to be the coolest way to get in contact with her.
Yes. Thank you so much, Shanna.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Take care.